Three thugs cornered a trembling young mother and her 5-year-old daughter in the most exclusive restaurant in New York, thinking they owned the room, thinking no one would dare to interfere, until a shadow rose from the corner table, and the entire atmosphere shifted like the air before a storm. They had no idea they were making a fatal mistake in the personal territory of Marcus Valerio, the most feared mafia boss on the East Coast, and he was watching their every move with steel-gray eyes filled with cold, lethal calculation. He walked toward them with the unhurried confidence of a predator, adjusted his cuff to reveal the serpent coiled around a black rose tattooed on his wrist, and delivered a 5-word warning that shattered their arrogance into absolute terror. If this story satisfies your soul, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from, because in this city, some tables are protected, and some days will change everything. La Dolce Vita sat atop the highest floor of an old, dignified building in the heart of Manhattan, a place whose very existence was a privilege to know about at all, where warm golden light from Murano crystal chandeliers poured down like melted honey and shimmered across silver cutlery polished so flawlessly it could serve as a mirror, where pristine white linen tablecloths lay pressed to the millimeter, never allowing a single wrinkle to exist for long, and where the scent of black truffle and porcini mushrooms mingled with the deep aroma of aged Barolo wine, to create an atmosphere reserved for those whose bank accounts carried 8 digits, where a violin whispered from some hidden corner, soft enough to signal refinement, yet loud enough to remind everyone present that this was a place where money was spent as casually as air. The kind of restaurant where trouble arrived in tailored suits and spoke politely, where violence wore cologne and addressed itself as Signor. And at the rear corner table, half concealed behind an exquisitely carved marble column, Marcus Valerio sat alone like a king upon an invisible throne. For 15 years earlier he had first walked into this restaurant with an enemy's blood not yet dry on his knuckles, and since that night the corner table had belonged to no one but him, sitting straight yet at ease, one hand resting on the table, the other lifting a glass of 30-year-old amber whiskey to eye level, watching the light pass through the liquid as if deciphering a private code only he could read, his steel-gray eyes drifting across the room with the indifference of a man who had seen too much darkness to be surprised by anything anymore, observing a businessman trying to impress a lover 20 years younger than himself, noticing an elderly couple celebrating their wedding anniversary in silence, with nothing left to say after 40 years together, catching sight of a lawyer secretly meeting his client's rival while believing no one had noticed. Marcus saw everything. Marcus always saw everything, but he did not care. Because tonight he had come seeking the one thing money and power could not buy: silence. He had not come to solve problems, not to meet anyone, not to do anything at all beyond sitting there, drinking whiskey, and pretending he was an ordinary man on an ordinary night. Yet fate had plans of its own, and sometimes those plans walked into a man's life in the form of a young mother wearing a threadbare coat and a 5-year-old girl with a pink knitted hat. Olivia pushed open the heavy glass doors of La Dolce Vita and stepped inside as though crossing into another world, a world she did not belong to, and one that both mother and daughter understood instinctively, her beige coat worn thin at the cuffs with a small tear on the left shoulder clumsily stitched closed, her white sneakers dulled to gray from countless hand-washings in the communal sink of a decaying apartment building, while beside her Lily clutched her mother's hand, wide eyes round as marbles opened in awe at everything around her. The child wearing a small floral dress bought from a second-hand shop for $3 and a pink knitted hat Olivia had made herself during sleepless nights, the hat concealing hair that had grown sparse and fragile from the side effects of medication, the restaurant manager regarding them with the cool appraisal of someone accustomed to measuring worth by clothing, and nearly escorting them out with polite firmness, until Olivia produced a crumpled handful of small bills, just enough to cover the cheapest appetizer on the menu, after which they were seated at a small table near the corner, as far from the sightlines of important guests as possible, and Olivia was grateful for that, because she had not come to be seen. She had come for her daughter, her 5-year-old daughter today, who had once seen a photograph of this restaurant, in a torn old magazine, in a hospital waiting room, and whispered with longing eyes that it looked like a princess's castle. Olivia having gone 3 days without food, drinking only water and eating scraps of stale bread, saving every tip from waitressing and cleaning jobs so that tonight, for this one night only, her child could step inside the castle of her dreams, ordering a single plate of pasta, the cheapest item available, and telling Lily that she was not hungry, that she had already eaten, while her stomach twisted painfully with emptiness. Yet all of that dissolved and became utterly meaningless when Lily lifted her small fork to her mouth and smiled. The first smile the child had shown in many months, after endless nights waking from nightmares, After silent tears shed from chest pain, after everything life had hurled at this 5-year-old, that smile lighting her pale little face like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, forcing Olivia to bite her lip hard to keep tears from spilling in this elegant dining room, thinking to herself that even for just one night, even if tomorrow meant returning to leftovers and thin soup, tonight her daughter was a princess, and she, a 27-year-old mother, with a faint scar at her temple and the shadows of hell in her memories, would do anything to make this moment last one more second, one more minute, one more hour. While from the corner table across the room, Marcus Valerio set his whiskey glass down, his steel-gray eyes having noticed them the moment they entered, recognizing their displacement among tailored suits and evening gowns, noting the way the young mother ordered only water for herself while pushing the plate of pasta toward her child, seeing the frayed coat, the worn shoes, the faint scar on the woman's temple, when the chandelier light struck at the right angle, and seeing the child's smile, pure and radiant, as if the world were still a good place. A fleeting memory surfacing in Marcus's mind, the blurred image of a dark-haired woman who had once looked at him with the same kind of love before darkness swallowed everything, causing him to shake his head slightly, brushing the memory away as he turned aside. This was not his concern. He did not save people. He did not want to save anyone. Yet his gaze kept drifting back, as though something unseen were pulling his attention toward the small table where a mother and daughter shared a single plate of pasta, in the simplest happiness he had witnessed in all his 15 years. Sitting in this restaurant, that fragile moment of peace shattered like glass striking stone, when the restaurant doors burst open and 3 dark figures stepped inside. Tony in the lead, a tall man with a face carved from contempt and the broad shoulders of someone accustomed to solving everything with force, followed by Marco, shorter but thick-set, his cold eyes sweeping the room like a predator assessing its territory, and finally Vince, leaner than the other two, yet carrying the cunning gaze of someone who had done more dirty work than anyone cared to imagine. All 3 wearing cheap black suits, the off-the-rack kind bought at discount stores, jarringly out of place among the finely tailored attire of the surrounding diners, the manager stepping forward to intercept them only to retreat instantly when Tony glanced his way, as though he had just looked death in the face, Olivia freezing mid-motion with the napkin raised to wipe Lily's mouth, not needing to turn around to know who had entered, recognizing Tony's heavy footsteps, recognizing the stench of cheap cigarettes and counterfeit cologne they wore, recognizing the way the air in the room suddenly thickened as if poison had been released. 2 years of running, 2 years of changing cities, changing jobs, changing hair color, changing everything that could be changed. And they had still found her. Of course they had. Derek never let anything that belonged to him escape. Lily looking up at her mother, the smile still on her lips but beginning to fade as she sensed the shift. "Mommy, what's wrong?" Her small voice clear and worried. Olivia forcing herself to smile, trying to say it's nothing, sweetheart, but her lips were stiff, and no sound emerged. The 3 of them already at the table, dark shapes closing in like a wall, cutting off every exit, Tony standing directly in front of Olivia with a smile that never reached his cold eyes, Marco blocking the path to the restroom, arms crossed, wearing the bored professionalism of someone who had done this far too many times, Vince on the other side, leaning casually against a chair, casting a glance at Lily that made Olivia want to lunge forward and claw his face, Tony bending down, his rough hand grabbing the collar of Olivia's beige coat and yanking her closer, close enough for her to smell the cheap whiskey on his breath, his voice low and sickeningly intimate, as if whispering to a lover rather than threatening a life. "Derek sends his regards. Olivia, he misses you. He really, really misses you." Olivia's heart pounding like a war drum, yet she did not cry, did not beg, did not give them the satisfaction they expected. She was past that stage, had cried enough, had begged enough during 5 years of hellish marriage to Derek Hayes, but she could not stop the tremor in her voice as she whispered, "Please, not here, not in front of my child." Tony laughing, the sound dry and cruel, while around them the diners glanced over and quickly looked away, a businessman adjusting his napkin as if it were the most important task in the world. A woman wearing a diamond necklace suddenly finding the bottom of her wineglass fascinating, an elderly couple pretending the room was entirely empty, the unspoken rule of the elite, your trouble is yours alone. Do not get involved. Do not dirty manicured hands. Lily beginning to shake, her small lips pressed tight to hold back a sob, her wide eyes filling with a kind of terror no 5-year-old should ever know, clutching her mother's coat, tiny fingers gripping until the knuckles turned white. "Mommy," Lily whispered, trembling. "Who are those men? Why are they making you scared?" And Tony merely smiled, tightening his grip on Olivia's collar, utterly unaware that from the shadowed corner table across the restaurant, steel gray eyes had shifted from indifference to focus, and the air around that table had suddenly grown colder than a New York winter. Lily's crying reached Marcus like a knife piercing, straight through the armor he had spent 25 years forging. Not a loud cry, not screaming or wailing, but something quieter, more suffocating, the sound of a child trying with all her strength not to disturb anyone, while fear grew too large to contain. And it was that small, trembling sound that triggered something buried deep inside him, something he had entombed long ago, ever since that winter night when he was 12 years old, because he remembered with brutal clarity the decaying house on the outskirts of Brooklyn, the smell of cheap vodka and sweat soaked into the walls, the slam of the door when his father came home after a night of gambling losses. He remembered his mother, a small woman with sad eyes and hands that always shook, trying to soothe the monster she had married, and he remembered himself, a thin 12-year-old boy hiding inside a warped old wardrobe, peering through the cracked door as his father's fists came down on his mother again and again. He remembered her crying, not screaming, but that same choked, broken sob, identical to the cry of the brown-haired little girl sitting 15 meters away in this restaurant. He remembered the helplessness, the terror that froze his limbs, the cowardice of a child who could not open the wardrobe door and do something, anything. He remembered the next morning, his mother lying motionless on the kitchen floor, blood dried at her temple, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling as if asking her son why he had not saved her. A question Marcus had never answered, a question he had carried for 25 years. Through every dark street he walked, every ruthless decision he made, every body left behind on his climb to the top of the underworld, telling himself he no longer cared, that he had died with his mother on that kitchen floor, that what remained was a cold machine built of hatred and ambition. But the cry of a 5-year-old girl had just torn those lies apart. Marcus set his whiskey glass down, the motion so controlled and deliberate that not a single drop rippled. He rose to his feet, and in that instant the air around his table seemed to solidify, the temperature dropping a few degrees, the chandelier light dimming ever so slightly. Nico, the gray-haired man who always stood near the door whenever Marcus visited the restaurant, lifted his head at once, instincts honed through 20 years of service to the Valerio family, telling him that something was about to happen. Marcus moved, and the way he crossed the room was like a black panther moving across the African plains. Unhurried, unforced, yet every step carried coiled power and unmistakable purpose. He did not avoid tables. Tables moved aside for him, diners leaning back instinctively as they felt his presence without understanding why. Golden chandelier light, casting bands of shadow across his angular face, half of it swallowed by darkness, the other half revealing steel-gray eyes burning with something older and more dangerous than anger. His black suit fitting perfectly on his 6'1" frame, not a crease, not a stray thread, as though it had been born to be worn by him. No tie, the top button of his black shirt undone, exposing the edge of a tattoo climbing from his collarbone, and as he passed, every table fell silent. Conversations died mid-sentence. Laughter caught in throats, as if the very air were holding its breath, because the boy who had been powerless in a dark wardrobe at 12 years old, the man of 37 would never be powerless again. Marcus stopped beside the table, where the 3 thugs were closing in on the mother and child, and his presence was like a massive iceberg suddenly rising from the sea, altering the current of everything around it. He said nothing for the first few seconds, merely standing there, nearly half a head taller than Tony, his shadow falling like a dark cloud over the group. Tony's hand was still gripping Olivia's collar, yet it froze mid-pull, as if his body sensed danger before his mind could catch up. Marco and Vince turned, both forced to look up into the face of the man who had appeared beside them like a specter from hell. The violin in the restaurant continued to play, but the sound felt strangled and distant, as though echoing from another world. Then Marcus spoke, his voice not loud, not shouting, not threatening in the way thugs usually threatened, but low and steady, like water flowing through a cavern, like wind before a storm, like the ticking of a bomb counting down. Wrong table. Wrong day, gentlemen. 5 words. Just 5 simple words. Yet the way he spoke them, the way each syllable fell into the air like drops of acid, the way his steel-gray eyes did not blink as they locked onto Tony, created an invisible weight pressing down on the shoulders of the 3 men. Time seemed to freeze. A waiter passing with a tray stopped mid-step. Forgetting what he was doing, a woman at the neighboring table held her wineglass suspended, neither drinking nor setting it down. The entire La Dolce Vita appeared to have been placed on pause, everyone sensing that something was happening, something larger than an ordinary confrontation, something that could end in blood if mishandled. Tony tried to regain control, forcing contempt into his voice. But his eyes betrayed him as he squinted at Marcus, pretending the man's presence meant nothing. "Who are you? This doesn't concern you. This is private," yet his voice trembled slightly at the end, and the hand gripping Olivia's collar began to shake, the fingers no longer clenching as tightly as before. Marcus did not answer at once, allowing the silence to stretch, letting it weigh on the air, giving Tony and his companions time to understand how catastrophic their mistake had been. Then he made a small motion, slow and deliberate to the millimeter, lifting his right hand and using his left to adjust his cuff, pulling the black fabric higher to fully reveal the tattoo on his wrist, a black serpent coiled around a black rose, thorns appearing to drip with blood, and beneath it a symbol instantly recognized by anyone in the East Coast underworld, a stylized letter V with 2 crossed swords, the Valerio family crest. The atmosphere in the room shifted at once, as if someone had opened a window in the middle of a snowstorm, and icy air rushed in. Marco inhaled sharply, eyes wide with horror. Vince stepped back without realizing he was doing it, and Tony, his hand still on Olivia's collar, went from flushed to deathly pale in the span of a single heartbeat, because he knew that tattoo, he knew that crest, and he knew he had just threatened a woman and a child on the territory of the man, the entire New York underworld called by a name spoken only in fear, the Reaper, Marcus Valerio. Vince was the first to understand the meaning of what he was seeing, because 10 years earlier, when he had still been a drifter in the South Bronx, he had witnessed a man buried alive for the simple crime of speaking ill of the Valerio name in a bar, his face draining from pale to ashen gray like burnt cinders, his lips trembling as if trying to speak while his throat had completely failed him. Leaning toward Tony as his whisper, though small, rang out like a death knell in the suffocating silence of the moment. "It's Valerio. God help us. Tony. That's Marcus Valerio." Tony heard him, and his reaction was like ice water thrown into his face in the middle of winter, his body going rigid, the hand still gripping Olivia's collar suddenly limp and lifeless like the hand of a corpse, because he knew that name, and who in the East Coast underworld did not? Marcus Valerio, the man who had built an empire from his father's ashes at the age of 22, the man who had unified the 5 largest gangs in New York without firing a single shot because what he did to his enemies made guns look like children's toys, stories whispered in the dark about what happened to those who dared oppose him, stories that made even the coldest killers shudder. Marco, who always wore calm professionalism like armor, now breaking into a cold sweat, beads rolling down his temples as if he had just run a marathon at noon in summer. All 3 men understanding that they had stepped onto an entirely different chessboard, one where they were no longer players with power, but small pawns that could be swept away at any moment. And Marcus, sensing their fear spreading like venom through their veins, took another step forward, just one step. Yet it was a step of invasion, a step of ownership, a step that placed him inside Tony's personal space, until they could almost feel each other's breath. Tony forced to look up into Marcus's eyes, and that posture, the posture of one man looking up at another, stripping away every shred of authority he had ever believed he possessed. Marcus did not shout, did not snarl, did nothing that thugs usually did to intimidate. He simply spoke, and each word landed like a bullet fired straight into the center of the forehead, precise, lethal, impossible to evade. "I will say this once, only once." His voice so low that Olivia nearly had to hold her breath to hear it. Yet within that quiet lived an authority no shout could ever rival. Let her go. 3 simple words. No threat attached. No description of what would happen if Tony disobeyed. The absence of a threat being the most terrifying thing of all, because it implied that whatever Marcus Valerio would do lay far beyond the reach of language. Tony swallowed, his throat dry as desert sand, glancing toward Marco and Vince for support, only to find both had already stepped back at least half a pace, their eyes making it clear that whatever happened next would be Tony's burden alone. "This is Derek Hayes' business," Tony tried to say, his voice shaking pathetically. "We're just following orders. This is family. It has nothing to do with you." Marcus tilted his head slightly, a small gesture of feigned curiosity, as if examining an interesting insect before crushing it beneath his heel. Then he spoke again, his tone flat and calm as a lake before a storm. "She is in my restaurant, at a table within my sight, with a child who is crying because of you." He stepped forward another half pace, forcing Tony to lean back to avoid brushing against his chest. "That makes it my business." And then Marcus lowered his voice one register further, So low it sounded like the growl rising from deep within a beast's chest. "This is the last time I will ask. Next time it will not be words." And then Lily cried. No longer the small, restrained sob she had been fighting to contain, but the raw, breaking cry of a child who could endure no more. "Mommy, Mommy," her voice tearing through the thickened air of the restaurant, clear and agonizing like shattering glass, like a heart splitting apart piece by piece. Her tiny arms reaching out toward Olivia, trembling fingers grasping for her mother's coat but failing to reach because Tony was still dragging Olivia forward. Lily's wide eyes overflowing with tears that streamed down her pale cheeks. And in those eyes lived the most primal fear of all, the fear of a child about to lose the only person in the world who protected her. Marcus looked at the child, and the world around him blurred as though a veil had been dropped over reality itself. He no longer saw La Dolce Vita, no longer saw crystal chandeliers or white linen tablecloths. He saw the decaying kitchen in Brooklyn, saw blood on cracked tiles, saw his mother's eyes staring lifelessly at the ceiling on that fateful morning. He saw himself, a 12-year-old boy kneeling beside her body, screaming until his throat tore open, while no one came to save him. That memory buried for 25 years, erupting with the force of a volcano, burning away every layer of ice he had so carefully built around his heart. Yet Marcus Valerio was not a man ruled by rage. He had learned long ago that explosive anger was the weapon of the weak, of small-time thugs like the three standing before him. True anger, the kind that could destroy empires, was the kind that was compressed, controlled, transformed into something denser, heavier, and infinitely more lethal. And that was exactly what was happening inside him now. The fury did not ignite but froze, becoming black ice flowing through his veins, becoming an invisible pressure crushing the entire room, diners at nearby tables beginning to feel short of breath without knowing why, a waiter standing close suddenly having to grip the wall to keep his balance, the air growing so heavy it felt as though the room were sinking to the bottom of the ocean, Marcus's jaw tightening until tendons stood out beneath his skin, his steel-gray eyes darkening to nearly black, the color of moonless nights, the color of bottomless abysses. He stepped closer to Tony, that step carrying the weight of 25 years of regret, 25 years of self-reproach, 25 years of swearing. He would never allow another child to cry the way he had cried beside his mother's body. Tony recoiled instinctively, stumbling back as his foot caught on a chair and nearly sending him to the floor, his hand still clutching Olivia's collar, now more reflex than intention, fingers shaking violently as if clinging to something in the midst of an earthquake, cold sweat streaming down his temples, lips moving as if to speak, though no sound emerged. Marcus stopped an arm's length away, close enough for his breath to wash over Tony's face, close enough for Tony to see the red threads of blood in the depths of those steel-gray eyes, close enough to feel the cold radiating from Marcus's body as if he were made of ice and shadow. Then Marcus spoke, and his voice was no longer the voice of a man but the low growl of something far more ancient and terrifying, something that had existed before humanity learned how to fear. "I will not say it a third time." And in that moment Tony looked into Marcus's eyes and understood, with absolute certainty, that if he did not let go within the next few seconds, he would not live to see the sun rise tomorrow. Tony let go, not because he chose to, but because his body had completely betrayed him, his fingers opening on their own as if an invisible force were snapping each joint apart, and Olivia's beige collar slipped from his grasp in silence. Olivia wasting not a single second, as she lunged toward Lily, with the speed of a tigress protecting her cub, wrapping her arms around her small daughter, and pulling the child tight against her chest, both arms locking around that fragile body as if she would never release her again. Lily burying her face into her mother's clothes, her sobs muffled by fabric while her tiny shoulders continued to shake in waves like a leaf caught in a storm. The three thugs retreating almost in unison, Tony staggering backward, his face pale as a corpse, Marco and Vince moving on pure survival instinct, their eyes never leaving Marcus for even a heartbeat, Marcus not sparing them another glance, as he simply raised his right hand and snapped his fingers once, a sharp sound that cracked through the silence like a miniature gunshot. Nico, the gray-haired man who had been waiting all along, appearing beside the three men like a ghost. And he was not alone. Two other men, massive and silent like walking slabs of stone, flanking him with eyes cold as steel, Nico saying nothing as he seized Tony by the collar and began to drag him away, the motion rough and utterly without hesitation, as though hauling a bag of trash out of a kitchen. Marco and Vince handled with the same ruthless efficiency, their arms wrenched behind their backs, their bodies shoved toward the door, and in less than 30 seconds, all three were dragged out of the restaurant like stray dogs chased from a feast they had never been invited to, the glass doors closing behind them, as the room exhaled, released from a curse, the violin suddenly sounding clearer, conversations cautiously whispering back to life, and La Dolce Vita slowly returning to its normal rhythm, though everyone knew they had just witnessed something they would never forget. Marcus turning back toward Olivia and Lily, and when he did, something strange happened. The cold fury in his eyes dissolved like snow under a spring sun, replaced by something softer, something human, something Marcus himself may not have known still existed within him. Olivia looking at him through tears and shock tangled together, not knowing what to say or what to do, clutching Lily and trembling as if she had escaped death by inches. Then Lily lifting her head, wide eyes still wet but no longer crying, looking straight at Marcus, with the pure curiosity of a 5-year-old child, the kind not yet stained by the world. "Who are you?" Her voice small and hoarse from crying, yet utterly unafraid, and that was what surprised Marcus the most. She was not afraid of him. After everything that had just happened, after watching him reduce 3 grown men to trembling wrecks, this 5-year-old looked at him with clear eyes and asked who he was, as if greeting a new friend. Marcus standing there for a moment, unsure what to do, having faced the most dangerous criminals in America without flinching, yet undone by the simple question of a child. And then he did something he likely had not done in 20 years. He knelt down, one knee touching the restaurant floor, his expensive suit surely gathering dust. But he did not care, kneeling so that his eyes were level with Lily's, so she would not have to look up at him as something frightening, but see him as an equal. And he spoke, his voice so gentle he barely recognized it as his own. "I am someone who will make sure no one ever hurts you or your mother again." Lily studied him for a long moment as if weighing the words, then nodded, a tiny nod, yet solemn, as though she had just accepted a vow. Marcus signaled to a waiter, and within minutes Lily was gently led to another corner of the restaurant where an enormous chocolate cake was waiting, the kind of cake a 5-year-old could only ever dream of in her sweetest fantasies, the little girl glancing back at her mother with anxious eyes until Olivia nodded reassuringly. And only then did Lily finally release her grip on her mother and follow the waiter, her tiny steps still slightly unsteady, and when her small figure disappeared behind the carved marble column, Olivia turned back to Marcus, and the wall she had built around herself over the past 2 years suddenly collapsed completely. She did not sob aloud, but tears flowed silently down her hollowed cheeks, and her narrow shoulders shook in waves, as though her body were trying to expel all the pain it had carried for far too long. Marcus said nothing. He simply sat down in the chair opposite her and waited, because he understood that sometimes silence was the one thing a person needed most. And then Olivia began to speak, her voice low and trembling like a candle in the wind. Yet she told everything, from beginning to end, as if the story had been trapped in her chest for too long and was slowly suffocating her. She spoke of meeting Derek Hayes 7 years earlier, when she had been a young nurse full of hope working at Mount Sinai Hospital, and Derek had been a patient with a broken arm from a car accident. How he had been gentle and romantic, how he said things no one had ever said to her before, and how she had fallen in love like a fool in love for the first time. They married after 6 months, a small wedding that Derek's father, Victor Hayes, a retired police chief, did not even attend because he believed she was unworthy of his son. The wedding night was the first night Derek hit her. A crushing slap because she dared to ask why he had been drinking so much. She spoke of the 5 years that followed, 5 years of hell she could not call by any other name. 5 years of beatings, humiliation, and imprisonment inside her own home, like a prisoner without a death sentence but also without a release date. Derek never hit her face. He was smarter than that. He struck where clothes would hide the bruises, and every time she tried to leave, he cried, apologized, promised to change, and she believed him, believed like a fool, again and again in the same lie. Then she became pregnant and she thought perhaps the child would change everything, perhaps Derek would become a good father. Perhaps life would finally have meaning, but she was wrong. Derek hated the pregnancy, hated that her attention belonged to something other than him. And one night, when she was 7 months pregnant, he kicked her hard in the stomach because she had not cooked the meal he wanted. Olivia stopped there, her voice catching as if someone were squeezing her throat, and Marcus felt his own hand clench into a fist beneath the table, knuckles bleaching white. Lily was born prematurely at 32 weeks, tiny like a doll, and the doctor said her heart was not fully formed, that she would need surgery, that she might not live long without proper treatment. Derek did not even come to the hospital. He said it was Olivia's fault for giving birth to a defective child. Yet she had endured 3 more years of his cruelty because Lily was too fragile to move and she had no money, until the night he raised a hand against her daughter. And that was the breaking point, Olivia said. her voice turning cold as if she were speaking of someone else. 2 years earlier, while Derek was away on a business trip, she had fled with Lily, carrying only $200 and a bag with a few old clothes. She thought she could start over, disappear, give Lily a normal life. But Derek never left her alone. He found her in Philadelphia after 3 months, and she had to run. He found her in Boston 6 months later, and she ran again. He had connections everywhere through his father, money, time, and he used it all to hunt her, as if she were prey, and he the hunter. She changed her hair color, changed her name, changed everything that could be changed. Yet he still found her, always found her. Marcus listened in silence through it all, his face revealing nothing, but inside he was burning. He looked at Olivia and saw his mother, saw sad eyes and bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, saw forced smiles and lies that everything was fine. He remembered the smell of blood in the kitchen that morning, remembered his own screams until his voice was gone, remembered the vow he had made that this would never happen to anyone else. And how many times had he failed that vow in 25 years? How many women had cried in the dark while he did not care? How many children had lost their mothers as he had lost his? But today, here and now, with this woman and this child, he would not fail again. The black, mirror-polished Maybach S-Class was waiting at the rear entrance of the restaurant when Marcus led Olivia and Lily outside, and the young woman had to stop for a second to stare at the car as if she were looking at a spacecraft that had just landed from another planet. She had never ridden in anything more expensive than the battered old Toyota Derek used to drive, and this Maybach was probably worth more than the crumbling apartment she was renting, combined with another 20 years of rent. Nico opened the rear door, and Marcus gestured for Olivia to get in first. Then he lifted Lily with a gentleness that was startling, as if he had done it 1,000 times before, settling the little girl into her mother's arms before walking around to the other side. The drive from the restaurant to Marcus's penthouse lasted about 20 minutes, and during those 20 minutes, not a single word was spoken. Lily fell asleep in her mother's arms, exhausted by too many emotions packed into one night, and Olivia simply sat there staring out the window at the city sliding past like a river of light, not knowing where she was going and lacking the strength to ask. Marcus sat opposite her, his face turned toward the glass, steel-gray eyes reflecting the flicker of streetlights, and he said nothing either, because he knew that sometimes silence was the greatest gift one person could give another. The car stopped in front of a glass and steel tower on the Upper East Side, the kind of building where security wore tailored suits and spoke in polite whispers. They took a private elevator up to the 43rd floor, and when the doors opened, Olivia stepped into a world entirely unlike anything she had ever known. Marcus's penthouse was vast, perhaps 10 times larger than the one-bedroom apartment she was renting, yet it was cold and empty like a museum after closing hours. Everything stripped down to an extreme minimalism, white walls without a single painting, black and gray furniture arranged with mathematical precision. No family photographs, no personal mementos, no sign that a real human being actually lived here. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed all of Manhattan at night, millions of lights glittering like stars fallen to earth. Yet even that breathtaking beauty could not warm the icy atmosphere of the space. Marcus showed Olivia the guest bedroom, a room larger than her entire current apartment, with a double bed dressed in pristine white sheets and a soft down comforter. Olivia laid Lily down, slipped off her tiny shoes, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and only when she was certain her daughter was sleeping deeply did she allow herself to break. The tears she had held back all night finally spilled free, not loud sobs but silent streams sliding down her cheeks, her shoulders shaking as she struggled not to make a sound that might wake her child. She cried from fear, from relief, from exhaustion, from everything she had endured over the past 2 years and the 5 years before that, from the fact that for the first time in 7 years someone had stood up to protect her instead of hurting her. Marcus stood outside the doorway with his back against the wall, watching through the narrow opening as Olivia sat beside her daughter's bed and wept in silence. He did not step in, did not comfort her, did not offer empty reassurances that everything would be all right, because he understood that sometimes a person needs to cry unseen, needs to be weak without shame. He stood there for a long while, then quietly walked away. Stepping onto the balcony and pulling out his phone, he called Nico, and his voice was ice cold as he spoke. Find out everything about Derek Hayes, his father, his assets, his work, his weaknesses. I want to know how he breathes. Nico did not ask why. 20 years of working for Marcus had taught him that when his boss spoke in that tone, questions were a luxury no one was permitted. He simply replied that there would be a report before noon tomorrow. Marcus ended the call and looked out over the city below, millions of lights blinking like promises never kept, and he wondered whether Derek Hayes knew that he had just awakened a monster that had been sleeping. The early New York sunlight slipped through the sheer curtains, waking Lily in a strange room she did not recognize. The little girl sitting up, rubbing her eyes, looking around with the confusion of a child surfacing from a dream that had lasted too long. Her mother still asleep beside her, her face pale yet more peaceful than it had been on any night in the past 2 years. And Lily did not want to wake her, so she slid gently off the bed, her tiny feet touching the cold wooden floor, and began to explore this new world with the uncontainable curiosity of a 5-year-old. The penthouse vast like a castle, yet eerily empty and cold. With no toys, no color, no sign that joy had ever lived there, Lily wandering through the living room, through the kitchen, down the long hallway of stark white walls, until she noticed the glass door to the balcony standing slightly open. And there, leaning against the railing with a cup of coffee in his hand, stood the man who had saved her and her mother the night before. Marcus heard the soft footsteps before he saw her, but he did not turn around. He simply stood there and waited, unsure what one was supposed to do with a 5-year-old at dawn. Lily stepped onto the balcony, her small floral dress wrinkled from sleep, her brown hair tousled, yet her wide eyes bright with curiosity and something close to courage. She stood beside Marcus, looking out at the city slowly waking below, and spoke the first words of her day. "Your house is very big," her voice small but clear in the morning air, "but it is very sad. No one laughs here." Marcus looked down at her, not knowing how to respond, because it was a truth he had never considered. This penthouse was worth $15 million, had the finest view in Manhattan, possessed every comfort money could buy, yet it had never known laughter. "Do you live alone?" Lily asked, tilting her head like a small bird studying something intriguing. Marcus nodded, still silent. Lily grew quiet for a moment as if thinking very seriously, then lifted her gaze to meet his eyes directly, eyes clear as spring water, and asked the one question no one in the world had ever dared ask him. "Are you a good person, or a bad one?" Marcus froze, the coffee cup in his hand suddenly heavy as stone. Impossible to lift to his lips, the question of a 5-year-old was simple to the point of cruelty, and that very simplicity pierced every layer of armor he had built over 25 years. What was he? He had killed, he had destroyed families, he had built an empire on the blood and tears of countless people, whose names he never bothered to remember. He was a devil in the eyes of the police, a nightmare whispered by enemies, the dark shadow feared throughout the underworld. Yet he was also the 12-year-old boy who had cried beside his mother's body. He was also the man who had stood between danger and 2 strangers the night before, without asking for anything in return. Who was he? What was he? Good or bad? Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came. And for the first time in his life he had no answer. Lily watched him for a long moment, then suddenly smiled, a tiny smile yet warm like the first sunlight of spring. "You saved my mommy," she said, her voice firm as if stating the most obvious truth in the world. "Bad people do not save anyone. Bad people only hurt others. Like my daddy. My daddy is bad, but you are not." She finished speaking and turned back inside as if she had just solved a simple puzzle, leaving Marcus alone on the balcony. And in that moment, for the first time in 25 years, Marcus Valerio felt something break open inside his chest. Not pain, not anger, but something warmer, softer, something he had believed had died with his mother in that decaying Brooklyn kitchen when he was 12 years old. He stood there, staring into the empty air, and a single tear slid down his cheek, which he did not bother to wipe away. Marcus stepped into the kitchen to make himself another cup of coffee, and that was when he noticed the small blue fabric bag resting on the island counter, the bag Olivia must have brought with her from the restaurant the night before, and forgotten to take into the bedroom. He had no intention of prying, but the bag was open, and the pill bottles inside were clearly visible in the pale morning light. Marcus picked one up, read the label, and his brow furrowed as he recognized pediatric cardiac medications, the same kind he had seen for years on his mother's bedside table, toward the end of her life, before violence took her instead of illness. Digoxin, furosemide, enalapril, the names reading like postponed death sentences, and Marcus understood at once that there was something far more serious than what Olivia had told him the night before. He set the bottle down and went to find her, his steps quicker than usual, finding her standing in the bedroom doorway, watching Lily play alone in the living room with eyes full of quiet dread. She turned at the sound of his footsteps and immediately recognized the gravity on the face that was usually carved from indifference. "Lily's medication," Marcus said, his voice not a question, but a demand for truth. What is wrong with her? Olivia closed her eyes for a brief second, as if gathering the strength to say what she had been hiding all night, then exhaled and began to speak. Lily had been born with a congenital heart condition, the result of being born far too early. A hole in her tiny heart that required surgical repair. The doctors had said that if the surgery was not performed within the next 6 months, her heart would weaken beyond saving. The cost of the operation was $300,000, a number that to Olivia might as well have been $300 million, because she had no health insurance, no family support, nothing but empty hands, and the shattered heart of a mother watching her child slowly die day by day. She had worked 2 jobs for the past 2 years, waitressing during the day and cleaning offices at night, skipping meals, wearing old clothes, living in the cheapest apartment she could find. And after all those sacrifices, she had managed to save only $20,000. $20,000 out of $300,000, not even 1/15, not enough to do anything except prolong despair. When Olivia finished, she stood there with her head bowed, as if waiting for Marcus to judge her for failing to protect her child better. But Marcus said nothing. He looked at her for a long moment, then at Lily sitting on the living room floor, trying to stack books from a shelf into a crooked tower, laughing when it collapsed. A clear and carefree sound, as if the world held nothing to fear, as if the small heart in her chest were not counting down each beat. Marcus turned and walked away without a word, leaving Olivia standing there, not knowing what he was thinking, not knowing what he would do, not daring to hope for anything because she had learned that hope was a luxury reserved for people luckier than her. Marcus stepped onto the balcony, closed the glass door behind him, and took out his phone. He dialed a number, waited 2 seconds, then spoke into the receiver in a tone that accepted no refusal. "I need to speak with Dr. Chen. Right now." 20 minutes later, Marcus returned to the living room, where Olivia was sitting with Lily, pretending to read her a book while her mind spun with 1,000 fears. He stopped in front of them, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, as if he were commenting on tomorrow's weather. "Lily's surgery will take place next week at Mount Sinai Hospital. Dr. Sarah Chen, the best pediatric cardiologist in the country, will perform it herself. All expenses have been paid." Olivia opened her mouth, but no sound came out, and she could only stare at Marcus, as if he had just told her the sun would rise in the west tomorrow. She tried to speak, tried to refuse, tried to cling to the last fragment of dignity she had left, but Marcus turned away before she could utter a word. "This is not charity," he said over his shoulder without looking back. "This is me paying an old debt, a debt I have owed for 25 years. In a rundown apartment on the other side of the city, Derek Hayes slammed his phone onto the table with enough force to shatter the screen into hundreds of tiny fragments. Yet the fury inside him still refused to subside. Tony had called to report, his voice trembling as though the fear had not yet left his bones, even after he had fled back to Queens for several hours. And what he described drove Derek from anger to madness and then to panic in less than 3 minutes. Marcus Valerio. The name hit him like a bucket of ice water to the face. Because although Derek was nothing more than a middling manager in the legitimate world, he had lived in New York long enough to know that the Valerio name was not something anyone wanted to be entangled with. His ex-wife, the prey he had hunted for 2 years, had somehow come under the protection of the most feared mafia boss on the east coast of America. Derek paced the room like a caged animal, kicking the wall, punching the door, screaming curses that no one heard, until at last he grabbed his backup phone and called the only person he believed could help him, his father, Victor Hayes, the former police chief of Brooklyn County, a man who had spent his entire career weaving a web of connections throughout the New York Police Department. Answered the call at 2 a.m. with the irritation of someone woken from deep sleep, but as he listened to his son's story, that irritation turned to concern and then to resolve. Victor had hated Olivia from the first day Derek brought her home, hated the hopeful innocence in her eyes when she looked at his son, hated that she had given birth to a disabled granddaughter who tarnished the Hayes family name, and he hated her even more for daring to run away, daring to take a child who was still legally under Derek's custody, daring to make his son a laughingstock among friends. "We will report her for kidnapping," Victor said into the phone, his voice cold and calculating. "I still have people in the department. We can get an arrest warrant within 24 hours. The next morning, Victor Hayes began calling in old favors, men he had helped over 3 decades in uniform, men he believed would never refuse him. But something strange began to happen. The first call went to a detective he had once shielded from scandal, and the man apologized and said he could not help right now. The second went to a senior officer Victor had once mentored, and the man claimed he was on leave and unable to do anything. The third, the fourth, the fifth, all ended the same way. polite but firm refusals, hurried hang-ups as if they were avoiding a contagion. Victor could not understand what was happening until the sixth call was answered honestly by an old friend. "Victor, you should stop," the voice whispered, as if afraid of being overheard. "Someone very powerful is protecting that woman. I cannot say who, but if you know what is good for you, you will tell your son to forget her." Immediately, Victor ended the call with shaking hands, and for the first time in his life he felt real fear. But that was only the beginning. While Victor was hitting walls with his old connections, Marcus Valerio was sitting in his office at Valerio Holdings playing a very different game. Nico's report had arrived early that morning, and what Marcus read gave him every piece he needed. Derek Hayes was a severe gambling addict, owing more than $100,000 to underground casinos and loan sharks. The real estate firm where he worked was, ironically, indirectly owned by a subsidiary of Valerio Holdings, and in police records there were at least 3 domestic violence complaints against Derek, all quietly buried through his father's influence. Marcus smiled, a smile devoid of warmth, containing only the cold calculation of a predator that had spotted a fatal weakness. He picked up the phone and began to call. The first call went to the Human Resources Department of the real estate company, and Derek Hayes was terminated immediately for breach of contract. The second call went to the loan sharks Derek owed, and every debt was called in at once. The third call went to a prominent human rights attorney, and the domestic violence cases that had been buried were suddenly unearthed and refiled with new evidence. Within 48 hours, Derek Hayes' world collapsed completely. He lost his job. He was threatened by loan sharks. He received a court summons on charges of serious domestic abuse, and when he called his father for help, Victor could only say in a shaking voice that there was nothing he could do, that someone far more powerful than either of them was moving against them, and that there was no way to win. Derek hurled the phone against the wall, screamed in the empty room, and swore he would not let this stand. That if he had to die, he would drag Olivia down to hell with him, unaware that this vow, uttered in madness, was the first step toward an ending so terrible that even in his worst nightmares he could never have imagined it. Mount Sinai Hospital on the afternoon before surgery carried a peculiar atmosphere, half quiet and half as though it were holding its breath in anticipation of something about to happen. Lily was taken to a private room on the pediatric cardiology floor, a white room with cartoon murals on the walls and a large window overlooking Central Park, yet no effort to make the place less frightening could fully mask the sharp scent of antiseptic or the steady beeping of monitoring machines. She sat on the white bed that looked far too large for her small body, dressed in a light blue hospital gown printed with teddy bears, her wide eyes darting around with fear she tried and failed to hide. Olivia sat beside her, gripping her daughter's hand, forcing a smile, while her lips trembled and her eyes burned red from tears. She was struggling to hold back. Marcus stood by the window looking out as if studying the city, though in truth he was wrestling with a feeling unfamiliar to him, fear for someone other than himself. Dr. Chen had visited earlier, explaining the procedure in a calm, reassuring voice, saying the success rate was very high and that Lily would be fine. Yet those words did nothing to erase the fear in the eyes of the 5-year-old girl. When the doctor left and the nurse finished the final checks, the room sank into silence. The heavy silence of things left unsaid. Lily suddenly spoke, her small voice trembling in the empty space, as she called Marcus by the name she had given him, Uncle Angel, and Marcus turned and stepped closer to the bed. Lily looked up at him with eyes clear as water and asked a question no child should ever have to ask. "Are you scared?" Marcus knelt beside the bed so his eyes were level with hers, and he did not know how to answer, because the truth was, yes, he was afraid to the point it felt as though someone were squeezing his heart, a sensation he had not felt in 25 years. But before he could speak, Lily continued, her voice like a whisper carried on the wind. "I am scared that if I sleep I will not wake up again, like my friend's grandmother at daycare. My friend said she went to sleep and did not wake up. I do not want that. I want to stay with my mommy." Olivia broke down then, unable to hold it in any longer, sobs tearing from her throat as if her heart were being ripped apart piece by piece. She pulled Lily into her arms, and mother and daughter cried together for a few endless seconds. Marcus stood there helpless, not knowing what to do or what to say, and it was the worst feeling he had ever known. Then he followed instinct, reaching out to take Lily's small hand, his rough fingers closing around her soft ones like a promise that needed no words. "You will wake up," Marcus said, his voice low but steady as steel. "I promise you, when you open your eyes I will be right here, and I will buy you chocolate ice cream, all the chocolate ice cream you want." Lily studied him for a long moment as if weighing whether his promise could be trusted. Then she nodded, a tiny yet solemn nod. "You promise?" she asked. "I promise," Marcus replied, and he had never been more certain of anything in his life. The night stretched on endlessly. Lily finally drifted into sleep after the nurse administered a light sedative, and Olivia sat by her side holding her hand, refusing to leave even for a moment. Marcus sat in the corner chair watching the two of them and remembering the last night his mother was alive. Remembering that he had not been there, had hidden in the closet like a coward, and that when he emerged the next morning it had already been too late. He would not let that happen again. When the nurse eventually asked them to leave so Lily could rest, Marcus and Olivia sat in the waiting room on hard, cold plastic chairs, staring at the clock on the wall, ticking with agonizing slowness, as if time itself were mocking them. They did not speak. Yet the silence between them was no longer the silence of strangers, but the silence of two people waiting together for something more important than any words could express. The chaos began in the hospital's ground floor lobby around 3 a.m, when the night was at its darkest and most people were lost in restless sleep. Marcus, hearing distant screams and the frantic sound of running footsteps as the instincts of a man who had survived the underworld for 20 years snapped every sense awake. He rose from his chair in the waiting room, motioned for Olivia to stay where she was, and stepped into the corridor, just as the elevator doors burst open with a shrill metallic screech. Derek Hayes, emerging like a demon released from hell, his eyes bloodshot from equal parts alcohol and madness, his clothes rumpled as though he had worn them for days without change, and in his hand a handgun, its barrel glinting under the cold fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway. 2 security guards had tried to stop him downstairs and failed, one now lying unconscious inside the elevator with blood streaming from his forehead, the other shaking as he tried to call for help. Derek shouting, his voice echoing through the quiet corridor like thunder in the dead of night. "Olivia, bring my daughter out here. I know you're here. You can't hide." Patient room doors slammed shut, nurses and doctors fled in panic to find cover, and the stark white hallway turned into a battlefield with an armed madman standing at its center. But there was one man who did not run. Marcus Valerio stepped out from the waiting room and walked straight toward Derek with neither haste nor hesitation, as though the gun in the other man's hand were nothing more than a toy unworthy of concern. Derek turned and aimed the weapon directly at Marcus's chest, yet the man in the black suit did not slow. "You!" Derek roared, spittle flying from his lips. "You're the bastard who stole my wife and child. Who do you think you are to interfere in my business?" Marcus stopped 3 steps away, close enough to see Derek's hand shaking, close enough to smell the cheap whiskey on his heavy breath. "She is not your wife," Marcus said, his tone as calm as if discussing the weather. "She is the woman you beat for 5 years. Lily is not your daughter. She is your victim, and you are standing in a hospital, with a gun, threatening a 5-year-old child who is about to undergo heart surgery." Derek laughed, a sound twisted with madness and pain. "You don't understand. You don't understand. She belongs to me. Lily belongs to me. No one gets to take what is mine." Marcus took another step forward, and Derek instinctively stepped back, though he was the one holding the gun. There was something in Marcus's steel-gray eyes that terrified Derek more than the bullet in his own chamber. A lethal stillness, an absolute certainty, the gaze of a man who had seen death too many times to fear it. "Do you know who I am?" Marcus asked, his voice even but each word landing like a sledgehammer. "Do you know what I do to people who threaten children on my territory? There are people who have disappeared, Derek Hayes, vanished completely from this earth, and no one ever found their bodies. Not because I hid them well, but because there was nothing left to find." Marcus stepped forward again, and this time Derek could not retreat, his back hitting the wall, the gun still aimed at Marcus's chest, but Derek's finger trembling so violently on the trigger he could not pull it. "Shoot me," Marcus said, stopping less than an arm's length from the barrel. "Shoot me and see what happens to you afterward. See what my people will do to you, to your father, to everything you have ever loved. Go on. I dare you." The silence stretched, taut enough to shatter the air itself. Derek stared into Marcus's eyes and saw the truth there, saw that this man was not bluffing, saw that if he pulled the trigger he would not only die but drag his entire family into hell with him. And in that instant all the madness, all the rage, all the force that had kept Derek upright for days collapsed like a sandcastle meeting the tide. The gun slipped from his hand and clattered across the floor, and Derek followed it down, dropping to his knees on the cold tile, sobbing like an abandoned child. "She's mine," he cried, tears and mucus streaking his distorted face. "Why doesn't anyone understand? She's mine." Marcus stepped back, picked up the gun, and removed the magazine with the practiced ease of a man who had done it 1,000 times. The elevator doors opened, and a team of police officers rushed in, weapons raised. But it was already over before they could act. Derek was handcuffed and dragged away, still weeping and muttering nonsense, and Marcus faded back into the shadows of the hallway, disappearing from the view of security cameras and witnesses before anyone realized he had ever been there. In the police report filed the next morning, there was no mention of a man in a black suit with a serpent tattoo on his wrist, as though he had never existed at all. The next morning, as the sun barely rose over the Manhattan skyline, Lily was wheeled into the operating room. Lying on the white gurney, small and fragile like a petal that could be carried away by the slightest wind, and when she lifted her hand to wave at her mother before the operating room doors closed, Olivia had to brace herself against the wall to keep from collapsing, Marcus standing beside her as the steel doors shut with a soft but final click, guiding Olivia to the waiting area where time would become more torturous than any prison on earth. 6 hours. Dr. Chen had said the surgery would last about 6 hours, and every one of those hours stretched out like a year. Olivia sat on the hard plastic chair, her hands clenched together until her knuckles turned white, her eyes locked on the operating room doors, as if looking away for even a second would invite catastrophe. Marcus sat beside her, and during the first hour he said nothing, sitting motionless like a stone statue. Yet his presence anchored Olivia, keeping her from being swept into the abyss of panic. By the second hour, Olivia began to tremble, her whole body shaking in waves as if seized by fever. And Marcus did something he had not done for anyone in 20 years. He reached out and took her hand, his palm large and rough, calloused and marked by sins that could never be washed clean. Yet when his fingers intertwined with Olivia's trembling ones, a faint warmth spread through the icy grip of her fear. They sat like that for the next 4 hours, saying nothing, holding hands and waiting, Marcus staring into the empty space ahead as memories surged back like an unstoppable tide. He remembered the night he was 12. The last night his mother was alive, hiding in the dark closet while he listened to her beg his father to stop. He remembered the blows, the kicks, the sound of her body hitting the wall and then the floor. He remembered the silence afterward, more terrifying than any scream. And he remembered the morning when he opened the closet door and found her lying motionless on the kitchen floor, her eyes staring into nothing, as if asking why her son had not saved her. He had sat beside her body for hours before the neighbors discovered them. And during those hours, he had sworn he would never be powerless again, would never let anyone take someone he cared about without doing something, anything. Yet now, sitting in a hospital waiting room with the hand of a woman he had met only days before in his own, Marcus realized he was just as powerless as he had been back then. He could kill Derek Hayes in 10 different ways without leaving a trace, but he could do nothing to guarantee that Lily's small heart would keep beating after this surgery. 6 hours passed, and when the operating room doors finally opened, both Marcus and Olivia sprang to their feet like tightly wound springs released. Dr. Chen stepped out, her face weary but a smile on her lips, small yet the brightest light either of them had ever seen. "The surgery was successful," she said. And those 3 words were a miracle, like the sound of heaven's bells ringing in the middle of hell. "Lily is very strong. She will need rest and monitoring, but she will be fine." Olivia crumpled, her knees hitting the floor as she sobbed, louder than she ever had in her life, broken cries tearing from deep within her chest, as if 7 years of pain and fear were pouring out all at once. Marcus stood beside her and exhaled, a long, heavy breath, realizing only then that he had been holding it for 6 hours without knowing it. 2 hours later, when Lily was moved to recovery and the anesthesia had worn off, she opened her eyes, those wide eyes drifting around the white room until they found her mother crying at the bedside, then found Marcus standing in the corner with something that almost looked like a smile on his usually cold face. And the first thing she said, in a hoarse and weak but unmistakably alive voice, was a question. "Uncle Angel, where is my chocolate ice cream?" The weeks that followed passed like a whirlwind of change, and when the dust finally settled, Derek Hayes' world had collapsed entirely into ash. The trial swift and merciless, with evidence stacked like a mountain, from old domestic violence complaints reopened, to the act of bringing a gun into a hospital and threatening murder, to testimony from dozens of witnesses who had once been too afraid to speak but now suddenly found the courage to tell the truth. Derek Hayes sentenced to 10 years in prison with no parole and no leniency. And as he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he turned back toward the gallery with eyes burning with hatred. But Olivia was not there to see it. She was at the hospital, sitting beside Lily's bed, reading fairy tales to her daughter as though the outside world no longer existed. Victor Hayes, the once powerful former police chief, tried everything to save his son and failed. The connections he had built over 30 years of service turned their backs on him. Doors that had always stood open now slammed shut, and when the trial ended, he was left an ailing old man alone in an empty house, without children, without friends, with nothing but memories of a bygone glory and regret over a son he had protected for far too long. Marcus watched it all from a distance, appearing at no hearings, allowing his name to touch no document, yet his invisible hand conducted everything like a maestro leading an orchestra. And when Derek was behind bars and every threat had been erased, he began rebuilding life for Olivia and Lily from the wreckage Derek had left behind. A new apartment on the Upper West Side with 2 bedrooms and round-the-clock security. The rent paid a year in advance. A new job for Olivia at a respected hospital. A pediatric nursing position with a salary that allowed her to live comfortably without working double shifts. A permanent restraining order against Derek and anyone connected to him. A savings account for Lily's future education. A skilled lawyer ready to defend them free of charge whenever needed. Marcus arranged everything with the same precision and efficiency he applied to running his underworld empire. And when he came to see Olivia one last time before she and Lily moved into the new apartment, she asked the question she had been holding back for so long. "How can I ever repay you?" Her voice breaking, her eyes shining with grateful tears. "You have given us everything. You saved my daughter's life. You gave us a new life." "I do not know how." Marcus stood in the doorway of the new apartment, afternoon sunlight casting his shadow long and dark behind him, and he studied Olivia for a long moment before answering. "Live well," he said, his voice still low and steady as always, yet softened by something gentler beneath the words. "Raise her strong, give her the childhood she should have had from the beginning. That is all I need. That is how you repay me." He turned and walked away, and Olivia stood at the door watching until his figure disappeared into the elevator. Lily ran out, grabbed her mother's hand, and asked in the clear voice of a 6-year-old child born a second time, "Uncle Angel is gone, Mommy. Will he come back?" Olivia knelt and wrapped her arms around her daughter, and she did not know how to answer. 3 months passed, and life in Marcus Valerio's penthouse on the 43rd floor returned to its familiar rhythm of silence and solitude. He continued to run his empire, continued to sit at the corner table at La Dolce Vita every Friday night, continued to be the dark shadow feared throughout New York's underworld. Yet something had changed. Something small and difficult to name, like a hairline crack in the wall of ice he had built around his heart for 25 years. And one ordinary afternoon, when Marcus returned to the penthouse after a tense meeting with his lieutenants, he noticed a small package resting on the kitchen island. Nico had left it there with a brief note saying it had arrived without a return address but showed no signs of danger. Marcus picked up the package and immediately recognized the uneven, childish handwriting on the label, and something unexpectedly warm stirred in his chest. He opened it to find a crayon drawing on standard paper, a drawing by a 6-year-old child with clumsy lines and colors spilling beyond the borders. Yet it was the most beautiful thing Marcus had ever seen. In the center stood a tall man dressed in black, faceless, only a solid figure with arms spread wide as if shielding someone. To his left were 2 smaller figures, one big and one small, labeled in crooked letters, "Mommy and me." To his right were 3 other figures with scowling faces drawn in harsh red and black crayon, clearly the bad people in the child's eyes. And beneath the picture, written carefully as though practiced many times before committing it to paper, were the words, "Thank you, Angel Man, love, Lily." Marcus stood there, staring at the drawing for so long he lost all sense of time. Inside the package was another envelope in an adult hand, and he opened it to read Olivia's letter. She wrote that Lily had drawn the picture 17 times before deciding it was perfect enough to send to Uncle Angel. She wrote that every night before sleeping, Lily prayed for the man who had saved her and her mother. She wrote that Lily said angels needed to know they were loved, even when they thought they were not angels at all. She thanked him not for the money or the apartment or the job, but for something greater than all of that, for showing Lily that strength could be used to protect, not only to destroy. Marcus folded the letter and looked around his luxurious yet empty penthouse. The white walls without a single photograph, the expensive furnishings without a trace of personal history. And then he did the strangest thing he had ever done in this home. He walked to the refrigerator, took a magnet from a drawer, and pinned Lily's drawing to the polished steel door. The crayon picture looked absurdly out of place on a refrigerator worth $20,000, in the middle of a minimalist, icy penthouse. But Marcus did not care. Every time he opened the fridge, every morning when he poured himself orange juice, every night when he looked for something to eat, he saw the drawing, saw himself through the eyes of a 6-year-old child, saw a black, faceless man standing between danger and the vulnerable, and it began to change him. Slowly, piece by piece, he started to reassess his empire, to look again at the operations he had built over 2 decades, and to ask questions he had never allowed himself to ask before. Human trafficking, Young girls sold like merchandise. He ordered it stopped, completely and permanently. Drugs, the poison that destroyed families and stole the future from children, he began to withdraw from. He kept what he could justify: high-end gambling, lending, protection of legitimate businesses, and cut away what he could not. Because every night, before turning off the lights, he passed through the kitchen and looked at the drawing, and he wondered whether, if Lily knew everything he had done, she would still call him an angel. 1 year later, on an ordinary Friday night like so many Fridays before it, Marcus Valerio sat at his familiar corner table in La Dolce Vita, a glass of whiskey before him, steel-gray eyes surveying the room with the practiced indifference that had become second nature. Everything appeared unchanged. The Murano crystal chandeliers still casting their warm golden glow, the violin still murmuring softly from the corner, the scent of truffle and expensive wine still lingering in the air. Yet something was different, something Marcus could not name until he saw 2 familiar figures step through the door. Olivia and Lily entered hand in hand with a confidence they had not possessed a year earlier. Olivia no longer the gaunt, frightened woman with hollow eyes, but someone healthy and self-assured, a radiant smile resting naturally on her lips. And Lily, now 6 years old, her brown hair thick and glossy, her cheeks flushed with life, moving with the carefree energy of a child whose heart no longer carried a ticking threat. Lily saw Marcus first, and before anyone could stop her, she ran straight through the restaurant, weaving between tables and startled guests, and threw her arms around Marcus's leg as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Uncle Angel," her clear voice rang out, and the entire restaurant fell silent, elegant patrons staring in undisguised shock at the sight of a tiny child clinging to the most feared man in the city. But Marcus did not care about their looks. He only looked down at the girl, and a rare smile softened the ice on his face. He knelt, so his eyes were level with hers, and Lily handed him a roll of paper, tied with a pink ribbon. "I drew it for you," she said, her eyes sparkling. "This time you have a smiling face, because you deserve to be happy." Marcus unrolled the paper, and inside was another crayon drawing, the black man standing protectively in the center. But this time he had a smile, a small red crayon smile, childish and imperfect and more beautiful than anything Marcus had ever been given. Olivia stepped closer, resting a hand on Lily's shoulder, and looked at Marcus with eyes full of gratitude. "She misses you so much," Olivia said softly. "And she is right. You deserve to be happy." They stayed for a while, talking about their new life, about Olivia's work, about Lily's school, about small ordinary things that a year ago had seemed impossible. And when they left, Lily turned back and waved, and Marcus waved back, a simple gesture he would once have considered weakness, but now understood as real strength. That night Marcus stood on the balcony of his penthouse, watching the rain fall over Manhattan, droplets tapping softly against the railing, the glass, his hair and shoulders, and he did not go inside. He let the rain wash away something of the man he used to be and thought about the journey of the past year. He thought about that first night in the restaurant, about the 3 thugs and the trembling woman, about the 5 words that changed everything. He thought about Lily's question on this very balcony. "Are you a good man or a bad man?" A simple child's question that had pierced every layer of armor he had built over 25 years. He thought of his mother, of the night he was 12, of the vow he had sworn never to be powerless again, and he realized he had kept that vow. Not by becoming a monster, but by choosing to stand between darkness and light, protecting those who could not protect themselves. He was not an angel. He knew that. His hands were still stained with the blood of the past, and there were sins that would never be forgiven. But he was no longer a devil either, no longer a cold machine that existed only to destroy. He was something in between. A man who had made terrible mistakes yet chose to do the right thing when it mattered most. The rain fell harder, washing the city in temporary grace, and Marcus lifted his face to the dark sky, letting the drops fall like tears he no longer knew how to shed. He thought of the drawing on his refrigerator, of the new one in his hands, of the clear, innocent eyes of a 6-year-old girl who had looked at him and seen an angel instead of a monster, and he understood that this was the greatest gift he had ever received. The chance to see himself through the eyes of innocence, the chance to believe that even those who had gone too far into the dark could still find their way back. "Wrong table, wrong day, gentlemen." The words echoed in his mind, but their meaning had changed. They were no longer a threat. They were a promise that some lines must never be crossed, that some people would be protected at any cost, that strength could be used to build rather than destroy. And that is the lesson this story wishes to share with all of you, that it is never too late to change, never too dark to find the light, that sometimes the people who seem to have lost all humanity are the ones most capable of love. If only someone is brave enough to see it in them, that one small act of kindness can change an entire life, and one simple question from a child can save a soul that seemed lost forever. If this story touched your heart, if you felt something while following the journey of Marcus, Olivia, and little Lily, please subscribe to our channel, like and share this video so we can bring you more moving stories every day. We want to know how you felt about this story, whether it reminded you of someone in your own life, whether it made you think of times when someone protected you or when you protected someone else. Leave a comment below and share what is in your heart, because every story is only complete when it is heard and felt. Thank you for staying with us until the very last moment of this story. We wish all of you watching good health, a joyful life, peace and happiness each day. And remember, no matter how hard life becomes, there are always angels around us. Sometimes they wear black suits and carry cold eyes, but their hearts are warmer than anyone else's. Goodbye and see you again in our next videos.